In November 2023, following decades of turmoil, Argentinians elected maverick libertarian Javier Milei as president. The chainsaw-wielding economics professor has promised economic shock therapy to stabilise the nation's ailing finances. Milei inherited a dire economic situation. Argentina faced an annual inflation rate of 142%, a currency that had lost most of its value, and a poverty rate of 40%. A country which had run out of road, having defaulted on its debt 4 times since 1980. Since taking office, Milei has set about slashing tax and spending, firing government employees and deregulating the overburdened Argentine economy. 1 year on, it seems to be working. But before we investigate Milei's policies, let's explore how Argentina got into this mess in the first place. In the early 20th century, Argentina was among the wealthiest nations in the world, boasting a GDP per capita higher than that of countries like France and Italy, with an impressive annual growth rate of 6%. During this belle epoque, Argentina attracted 4 million European migrants, lured by the promise of prosperity and the chance to become as rich as an Argentine. Buenos Aires, with its elegance and cultural vibrancy, earned the nickname the Paris of South America. This economic success was not inevitable. Argentinian independence had established important principles such as the division of powers, equality before the law, and protection of private property rights. A stable institutional framework created the certainty that individuals needed to invest and scale their businesses. The abundance of fertile land, particularly in the littoral provinces of the northeast, allowed for a booming agricultural industry to develop. The country exported large quantities of sheep and cattle products. Facilitated by open trade policies, Argentina experienced a prolonged export-led boom. And by the 1920s, Argentina contributed around 4% of all global trade. The profitability of agriculture, in turn, encouraged foreign investment into other industries and into infrastructure, such as the railways. By embracing free trade, capitalism, and liberal democratic institutions, Argentina ushered in decades of economic growth. But this golden age was not to last forever. Years of mismanagement led the country into turmoil, leaving its economy hollowed out and unable to keep pace with international competitors. It is one of a sorry handful of countries which have regressed from developed to developing. So why did Argentina decline? The answer, as is so often the case, is government intervention. Although the Great Depression didn't hit Argentina as hard as it hit other nations, it did cause the nation's agricultural exports to Europe and America to fall sharply. To stimulate overseas trade, the government devalued the peso in 1929 and abandoned the gold standard. However, despite these efforts, export values plummeted from $1.5 billion in 1929 to just $561 million by 1932. But the Argentine government had built a social security system on the assumption of high exports and high growth. Ultimately, this meant that it became difficult for the government to pay public sector workers, leading to simmering unrest. This problem was magnified by farmers who, deprived of their livelihood, left the countryside to find new work in the cities, leading to overcrowding and unrest. These pressures culminated in a coup against President Hipólito Yrigoyen, bringing Agustín Justo to power. For the remainder of the 20th century, Argentina would see more military leaders than civilian, with presidents averaging just 2 years in office between 1930 and 1983. This political instability played a central role in catalysing Argentina's decline, with investors scared away from the country due to rapid changes in policy. Scarred by Argentina's vulnerability to global trade winds during the Great Depression, successive governments during this period pursued a policy of import substitution, hoping, in vain, to obtain self-sufficiency in industry and agriculture. Tariffs and quotas were used extensively, with the aim of building domestic industrial capacity by restricting foreign competition. Internally, investment in industrial growth was prioritised over agriculture, causing that sector to decline even further. This accelerated mass migration to the cities, where inadequate infrastructure gave rise to shanty towns, known as villas miseria. Urban workers encountered socialist and anarchist ideas brought over by European migrants, laying the groundwork for the ideology known as Peronism. Peronism would leave a lasting mark on Argentina's political and economic trajectory for decades to come, ultimately leading to the consensus which brought about the radical change instituted by Javier Milei. After manoeuvring his way to the presidency in 1946, military leader Juan Domingo Peron promised a third way for Argentina, a middle ground between capitalism and socialism, centred on a nationalist, state-controlled economy. In practice, this meant that Argentina's economy lurched towards a centrally planned economic model, which soon degenerated into zero-sum competition between powerful organised interest groups, each vying for portions of an increasingly small pie. In fact, under Peron, a sprawling welfare state quickly sprang up. Government spending tripled between 1946 and 1949, and by 1955, the number of state employees had doubled. The influential General Confederation of Labour expanded dramatically, securing unionised workers substantial inflation-busting pay rises. Key industries like gas, electric and telecommunications were nationalised, while a slew of inefficient state-run companies emerged. These were heavily subsidised by the public purse and shielded from foreign competition through strict import controls, effectively cutting Argentina off from global markets. In a symbolic blow to foreign influence, Peron nationalised British and French-owned railways, which had once driven Argentina's economic growth. Instead of boosting the economy, however, the state-run railways became a financial albatross. By the 1960s, rail subsidies were draining $1 million a day, a figure which doubled by the 1980s, accelerating the country's mounting national debt. But it wasn't just industry that suffered. Micromanagement of the economy was everywhere, extending to exchange controls, control of rent, and even the setting of prices and menus for restaurants. To stimulate exports, the government even devalued the currency, with the aim of improving terms of trade. The peso, which in the aftermath of World War II was one of the most stable currencies in the world, saw 70% of its value wiped out between 1948 and 1950. Inflation ran at 50% in 1951, with the state printing even more money to pay for all of these populist pledges. The country was thus locked into an economic doom loop. Inflation made the nation's goods more expensive, reducing foreign demand for Argentinian imports. This reduced demand for the peso depressed its value on international currency markets. In turn, a weakened currency meant that more pesos were needed to buy the same amount of imported goods, further driving inflation. The result was predictable. Investment slowed to a trickle, while powerful unions paralysed the country through successive general strikes. By 1950, Argentina's GDP per capita fell to less than half of that of the United States. In the 1930s, that figure had often risen as high as 70%. In 1955, this situation became untenable. The Argentinian military intervened, seizing power and sending Peron into exile. Despite the continuing stranglehold of the country to the planteo, or military ultimatum, Argentina experienced limited success under President Frondizi between 1958 and 1962. Frondizi shifted Argentina to a corporatist model, retaining central planning but involving greater business collaboration, an improvement over Peron's authoritarianism, but by no means a free market approach. Frondizi had set out to achieve national oil self-sufficiency for Argentina, and successfully courted the necessary foreign investment to achieve this, which helped to propel nearly 13 years of uninterrupted economic growth. Inflation also fell from 113% in 1959 to 14% in 1961. However, these lows were never sustained, and inflation remained high in comparison to other economies during the same period. Another coup in 1966 saw Juan Carlos Onganía gain power. Indicative of the constant chopping and changing of government policy, under Onganía, Argentina abandoned import substitution, opening the economy to global markets. However, years of Peronist protectionism had created high-cost domestic industries unable to compete internationally. Further, with inflation having decreased sharply, the consequent strengthening of the peso meant that importing from abroad became so cheap that many domestic industries declined. The government responded by further devaluing the currency 30%, and by 1970, inflation had returned. Peron returned briefly to government in 1973, but died a year later, as the world was hit by a crisis in the supply of oil. Increased energy prices and foreign protectionism in the aftermath of the oil shock hit Argentina hard. Policies implemented by Economy Minister Celestino Rodrigo in 1975 made the situation even worse. The Rodrigazo economic policies attempted to stem wage growth while updating state utility and transport prices in line with increasing inflation. This was accompanied by a 150% devaluation of the peso. These policies caused the government to fall out of favour with its staunchest supporter, the General Confederation of Labour. They held the first ever general strike under a Peronist government. Rodrigo backtracked, ceding to wage demands and creating a wage price spiral where high spending on wages contributes to rising prices across the economy. Inflation increased from 24% in 1974 to 182% in 1975, kicking off a decade of inflation above 100%. Capitulation to socialism and the unions had wrecked Argentina's already fragile economy. From 1976 to 1983, another military dictatorship followed. This regime presided over an enormous expansion in Argentina's foreign debt and numerous massacres of suspected dissenters. In 1982, seeking a distraction from domestic troubles, the military launched an invasion of the Falkland Islands. Britain retaliated, and Argentina was soundly defeated. This humiliation ultimately prompted the return of democracy to Argentina in 1983. However, the Peronist ideas responsible for Argentina's economic woes endured. Under President Raúl Alfonsín, public payrolls swelled, while government revenues remained stagnant. Inflation, peaking at 5,000% in 1989, was so high that Argentina's national money printing presses broke down. Prices changed so rapidly that supermarkets opted to read them out over intercoms rather than bother to update price tags. The net effect was that between 1975 and 1990, real per capita income in Argentina fell by more than 20%, wiping out almost 3 decades of economic development. The manufacturing industry, which had formerly undergone a period of uninterrupted growth, began a process of continuous decline. In fact, the degree of industrialization in Argentina at the start of the 1990s was similar to its level in the 1940s. The situation was so dire that Alfonsín voluntarily handed power over 5 months early to his successor, Carlos Menem, and for a while it appeared that Argentina was finally going to change course. But despite some limited privatization efforts and a falling inflation rate, Menem didn't address Argentina's addiction to public spending. Although domestic money printing was halted, the government simply borrowed more from abroad. Fernando de la Rúa assumed power in 1999, but his government avoided making public spending cuts, relying instead on printing money to cover expenditures. Stricter exchange controls were introduced to curb capital flight, but the economic crisis deepened. Politicians repeatedly dodged the tough decisions needed to save Argentina's economy, passing the burden to one another and allowing the situation to spiral further out of control. Between 1998 and 2002, the Argentine economy shrunk by a fifth. Unemployment hit 18%, and thousands of young, educated Argentinians emigrated to their grandparents' ancestral homes in Europe. Violence and rioting ensued. De la Rua's government declared a state of emergency. The government sought an IMF bailout of $40 billion. But with growth running at just 0.5% in 2000, it was soon forced to default. In doing so, it reneged on more than $100 billion in debt, the world's biggest ever sovereign default. In the immediate aftermath of this crisis, Argentina saw 5 presidents in just 2 weeks. Between 2003 and 2023, successive Peronist governments nearly doubled the size of Argentina's public sector, pouring money into welfare programs and running persistent deficits to fund them. The crisis came to a head in 2023 when Alberto Fernandez imposed strict currency controls, including a $200 monthly exchange limit per citizen and a 35% tax on foreign currency transactions. These measures fueled the resurgence of an underground foreign exchange market, undermining the government's grip on the peso. By 2022, inflation had hit a staggering 100%, with 55% of Argentine children living in poverty. In 2023, inflation soared to 142%, sparking a widespread backlash and bringing the decades-long Peronist dominance to breaking point. Enter Javier Milei, an economics professor, self-proclaimed anarcho-capitalist, and political firebrand known for his combative style and deep disdain for the state. Milei burst onto the political scene in 2021 with his election to Congress, stunning the establishment by emerging as a surprise contender in the October 2023 presidential race. After a tight first round, Milei went on to defeat seasoned politician Sergio Massa in the final second-round ballot. Milei was inaugurated in December 2023, and after a year in office, what has this maverick libertarian accomplished so far? First, he's taken a chainsaw to state bureaucracy, literally, halving the number of government departments in the country, cutting public sector salaries by 20%, and reducing procurement costs across government. His new Ministry of Human Capital merges the previous departments of social development, education, culture, and labour. He's also fired about 24,000 civil servants, with more layoffs on the horizon. Milei has also ended costly subsidies for energy, rent and transport, while non-essential local government funding has also been cut. Congressional plans to introduce an inflation lock on pensions in the country have been vetoed, as have proposed increases to funding for public universities. He's also taken action on immigration. Free provision of healthcare to immigrants in Argentina is coming to an end, while new fees are being introduced for foreign university students. He's also proposed plans to automatically deport foreign criminals from the country. Milei has bored a hole into Argentina's economic model of addiction to irresponsible government spending. He has cut public spending by almost a third in real terms. This has enabled him to deliver the first Argentine budget surplus in 12 years, a remarkable feat he achieved in his first month of office and has achieved every month since. Cutting public spending has reduced pressure on the central bank to print money. This has caused inflation to plummet. When Milei took office, inflation was raging at 13% per month. Now it's down to 3%. For everyday Argentinians, this means that the cost of basic goods is finally beginning to stabilise. It is particularly impressive that he has achieved this alongside devaluation of the peso. Doing so caused inflation to rally right at the beginning of his premiership, an important step as the currency has been artificially and unsustainably strong for too long. But such a radical programme to stabilise the Argentine economy was never going to be easy. As a result of Milei's harsh economic medicine, the country fell back into a brief recession, the poverty rate jumped, and unemployment temporarily increased. But avoiding short-term hardship is exactly what has landed Argentina in this mess. Milei's government has put an end to the consensus of unsustainable social welfare programmes and inefficient zombie companies propped up by state support. This is the model which is responsible for hyperinflation, poverty and unemployment in the first place. As Milei's policies have taken effect, the recession also seems to have bottomed out. After an initial decline, annualised GDP grew by 3.9% in Q3 of 2024, with the Argentine economy projected by JP Morgan to grow by 5.2% in 2025. By contrast, neighbouring Brazil and Chile were predicted to grow by 3% and 2.1% respectively. Milei's government understands that tackling inflation is the key to unlocking investment and growth. For Argentinians, inflation destroys savings, so people rush to spend before their money loses value, preventing long-term investment. For international investors, a decline in inflation signals that Argentina is once again a place to trust, invest and grow businesses. With inflation under control and the money printing halted, Argentina's risk profile has dropped significantly. The JP Morgan Country Risk Index, a key measure of default risk, has halved to its lowest level in 5 years. Argentina is now on track to enjoy the same favourable risk premiums as its South American neighbours. Investors are unsurprisingly bullish. The S&P Merval, which tracks major Argentine companies, has hit record highs under Milei, and the stock market has surged by 125%. New laws like the RIGI investment incentive are accelerating the flow of international investment. This programme offers tax, customs and exchange benefits for investors who commit over $200 million to Argentina for 30 years. Rio Tinto's CEO recently praised Milei's investment-friendly environment and announced a $2.5 billion investment package in Argentina's lithium industry. Milei has also adopted a pragmatic approach to global trade relations. Despite calling China's government murderous communists during the election campaign, he now praises China as a fabulous partner. He's also struck a deal to sell gas to Brazil, whose president he once called a corrupt communist. Argentina's mining exports are set to rise 6% this year, and sectors like energy and agriculture are once again booming. The process of reopening Argentina to world trade is in full swing, with the government dismantling trade barriers that have fueled inflation and isolated the economy for decades. At the same time, Milei has slashed domestic regulations, freeing up markets from housing rentals to airlines. Even divorce and satellite internet have been liberalised. New reforms will reduce the number of national taxes from 165 to fewer than 20, with VAT and income taxes in the firing line. Rising poverty, hidden by unsustainable government spending, is out. Milei has unleashed private sector dynamism, bringing the country's recession to an end, putting inflation on a sustainable path and driving growth across the economy. For many Argentinians, life is already improving. The end of rent controls in Buenos Aires has boosted apartment supply by 170% and driven rents down by 40%. Despite overseeing the largest austerity programme in Argentinian history, Milei continues to be popular. His party leads in the polls for the 2025 legislative elections, and his approval rating stands at 48%, higher than his two predecessors after their first year in office. Milei faces a significant challenge in the coming year. He's promised to remove the rigid capital and currency controls which have scared off investment in Argentina for decades. But to do this, he needs to shore up the foreign currency reserves of the Argentinian central bank. Otherwise, he risks a run on the peso, pushing inflation back up. This will be no easy task. The balance sheet of Argentina's central bank was negative $11 billion when Milei took office. Although it has since improved, the central bank continues to run a negative balance sheet, meaning that Milei's efforts to get inflation under control whilst also removing capital and currency controls will be no mean feat. The peso is also beginning to again look overvalued. Although Milei devalued the peso by 50% in December 2023, and then by 2% each month since, inflation has been running higher than this, and so the real exchange rate has been rising. Until the peso is put on a free-floating exchange rate, state planning will continue to distort price signals. However, leaving the peso to float could also prove politically challenging for Milei. Argentina has had numerous stabilisation plans since 1952, all of which has failed, but they have all hinged around currency and money supply manipulation, never addressing the inflationary biases embedded into Argentina's economy. By contrast, Milei's government has begun to unwind these, cutting back on the high levels of regulation, taxes, bureaucracy and protectionism that have held Argentina back for so long. Just a year into his presidency, Milei still has significant challenges ahead of him. But Argentina's incredible Milei boom shows what politicians can achieve with sufficient commitment, will and ambition. It also shows us what can happen when the state gets out of the way. So what can we learn from Javier Milei? In the UK, the tax burden is at the highest level since records began, with government collecting over $1 trillion in tax revenue each year. While $89 billion of this is spent paying off the interest on prior debts, a further $120 billion is borrowed each year, augmenting our total stock of national debt. The NHS eats even more funding, whilst underperforming against comparable countries on cancer, stroke and heart attack survival rates. State pension contributions spiral due to the ratchet effect of the triple lock. Our rigid planning system stifles home building, renders housing unaffordable and contributes to labour immobility. There is much to take away from Milei's example, as he slashes the size of the state and unleashes the private sector to generate growth. The financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic embedded the idea that the state should always intervene to stave off adversity and should borrow money to pay for it. Global public debt has risen from 70% of GDP 20 years ago to 93% this year. By 2030, it is projected to hit 100%. This is not just a problem in the developed Western world, but also in China and India, which both run large deficits. Countries around the world face a mounting burden of healthcare and pension costs as global populations age. Regulatory burdens only ever seem to grow. But in Argentina, Milei has challenged the political orthodoxy by cutting back on regulations, reducing unnecessary spending, and lowering taxes. Argentina now has a better chance than almost any nation in the world to turn around its ailing fortunes. Global politicians could learn a thing or two from Milei's example, challenging received wisdom and daring to dream. Milei's policies have also found endorsement from the incoming Trump administration. The co-heads of the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, have both expressed their admiration for Milei's policies. According to Ramaswamy, the US needs Milei-style cuts on steroids, while Musk has praised Argentina's impressive progress. According to Milei, Argentina is entering its best moment in 100 years. So could this maverick libertarian really make Argentina great again? Only time will tell. But the early signs are positive.